Sir has done his BTech in Aeronautical Engineering in June 1988 from the Department of Aerospace Engineering, IIT Kanpur. Sir has done MS in Aerospace Engineering in 1990 from Department of Aerospace Engineering in University of Minnesota from USA, and a PhD in Aerospace Engineering in October 1992 from the University of Minnesota in USA. Regarding work experience, sir is working as a professor since November 2003 at the Indian Institute of Technology, Kanpur, in the Department of Aerospace Engineering. Sir has also worked as a head of aerospace engineering from February 2013 to 2017 at IIT Kanpur. Sir is also has worked as a research associate from November 1992 to 1994 at Army High Performance Computing Research Center in the University of Minnesota in USA. Sir has also worked as a visiting professor from May to July 2012 as a chairperson for computational analysis of technical systems in Germany. Regarding his achievements and awards, sir has received ICCES Distinguished Achievement Medal for contributions to computational fluid dynamics in the 2015 from USA. He's also the Arun Kumar Chair Professor 2015 IIT Kanpur. Sir has also received G.D. Birla Prize for Scientific Research for the year 2015, selected in 2016 by K.K. Birla Foundation. The Dr. APJ Abdul Kalam High Performance Computing Award in 2017. The Best Aero Professor Award of the Year in the 2019 by Society of Aeronautical Engineers. The Scopus Young Scientist in Engineering in 2007 by Elsewhere New Delhi. The Professor Mittal has more than 2 decades of research experience in the computational fluid dynamics domain. He has worked on large-scale computations of compressible and incompressible unsteady flows, including those that involve moving boundaries and domains. His research interests include both fundamental aspects of fluid flows and design of numerical methods, as well as their application to situations of practical interest. He also has experience in carrying out experiments in wind tunnels. Some of his research areas include high performance computing, design of accurate and robust numerical methods, experimental aerodynamics, the low speed wind tunnel testing, flows in supersonic wind tunnels and diffuser, the unsteady transonic flow past wings and aerofoils, and many more. Sir is having more than 130 international and national journal publications and more than 60 international conference publications. Sir, we are very fortunate to have you as an expert in our short-term training program. Your knowledge will be highly beneficial to our participants. So you can start your presentation now, sir. Thank you very much.
Okay. Okay. Thank you very much, Professor Thakur. It's an absolute pleasure to get this opportunity to interact with the participants in this workshop. I'm absolutely delighted to to be able to participate and do this in this very strange era of this pandemic, where interactions have virtually come to a halt. And it's really a miracle that using the technology we can actually still interact with each other. So what I have prepared today, I hope you find it interesting, is I'll begin by first saying something about what is CFD from my perspective, and then I will show you some examples of some of the problems that we have done. So you can feel free to interrupt me anytime you think there's something you don't understand, and I'll be happy to clarify. Okay, so I've been at IIT Kanpur, as Professor Thakur mentioned, for more than 25 years now. And in fact, I did my BTech also at this place. So I have a lot of passion for this university. And when we completed our 50 years of existence, IIT Kanpur, I mean, a stamp was released, a postal stamp. And what you see in this picture is actually the library building, and there's a pond outside it, which was used for evaporative cooling back in those days when the air conditioners were on a slightly older technology. And this picture was kind of titled Reflections. where there's this iconic picture of a building from IIT Kanpur, and then you see its reflection in the pond. And I suppose it kind of means that being an institute which has existed for more than 50 years, maybe we should reflect on what we have done and what we could have done and plan our things ahead. This picture was taken by a colleague of mine. So right away, I would like to acknowledge the contributions of several students who have worked in the laboratory. I have not listed them here. That would be a very long list and it would clutter this nice image. Would like to show you some nice pictures from the institute. So these are some buildings which look very nice right after monsoon. Those are the pictures in the top row. Actually, our health center in the top left. Then there's a hostel 1, which is for 3rd and 4th year students, the BTech students, and the adjoining garden. Then there's a picture of the National Wind Tunnel facility in the second row, its fan, and a model of the light combat aircraft installed inside the tunnel. And then some beautiful birds in the campus. So if you have a chance to visit us sometime, I'm sure you'll be delighted with the campus. Now, CFD, people have been using it for quite some time now, and it can really do wonders. It has reached a stage where one can actually use it to study quite a few things, and I have chosen some interesting examples. At least I find them interesting. The first one on the left, the top left, is a picture of 2 cyclists. So imagine if you are a member of an Olympic team and you are preparing to race, in a bicycle event, and the question you ask your coach is that for most of the time during the event, should I be following somebody or should I be leading the pack? So who is going to spend less energy? The guy on the upstream side or the guy on the downstream side? So you can actually do very quantitative simulations and get an answer. Okay, what should be the optimal distance? When should you overtake? What is the burst of energy you need? So on and so forth. Then the next set of pictures in the upper row are for the Formula One racing, wherein you can see the pressure distribution on the various components, like on the tires, then the air intake, on the other parts of, in fact, there's an inverted wing at the rear of the racing car, which kind of holds it to the ground. So one can use CFD to design these, and it's a very cutthroat competition. So how to efficiently make a vehicle which conforms to the rules of the racing and yet delivers very high performance. All that CFD can play an immense role. In fact, you'll be surprised to know, if you already don't know, that most of the wind tunnels, the bigger wind tunnels in the world, they actually engage in Formula One racing. There is more money in Formula One racing now than in aerospace design of commercial vehicles. So it's really very big. Another example is the swimming. So suppose I'm an athlete and I ask my coach, am I perfecting my strokes? Simple things like flow through my fingers. Should I keep my fingers together so that there is no gap? Or should I keep some gap in between them and allow the water to escape and thereby energize a bigger mass of water during my stroke? So all that actually is possible to do using CFD now. Okay, very detailed. So in fact, the US swimming team uses these technologies, and what they do is they take videos of these swimmers during the event, the practice, and then take slices of through MRI or whatever, make grids, do the finite element analysis, and then try to figure out how the athletes can perfect their strokes and thereby win a medal for their country. So there's a lot of things at stake. Next is the example of the hypersonic vehicle, and I'll give you some examples of that as we go along. So the design of that and to optimize it, again CFD can be very useful. And the last example is actually the soccer ball, wherein Adidas now has the contract for designing the soccer balls, and they seem to change the design every season, and it becomes more challenging for the players to control this object. As you very well know that soccer players, they actually impart a rotation to the ball during their kick, and that way they can control the swerve of the ball and kind of fool the goalkeeper, and perhaps either during penalty kicks or even during long shots they can have an edge over the other players who don't use the swerve. So how is all this possible? Well, of course you have to model the flow, and I've shown you here some flow equations. You're all most likely very familiar with them. So shown here are these two sets of equations, the mass balance, which is the simple divergence U equal to 0, and then the force balance, and here we are using a Newtonian fluid model along with some boundary conditions and initial conditions. So these equations have to be solved, and they are difficult, primarily for the reason because they are unsteady, they are nonlinear, the convection term is nonlinear, and then they are coupled. I mean, you cannot solve them one at a time, they are all coupled, and of course they are partial differential equations. Okay, so they are really as complex as it gets. In fact, when people talk about the most complex phenomena in today's science, they actually talk about quantum mechanics and fluid mechanics. So those of us who are working in fluid mechanics, we really have a difficult problem to look at. So the idea is to program these equations on a computer through some algorithm, and I will talk about it very, very briefly, and then churn out numbers and see what best a solution one can get. So very important is to look at the evolution of the computing, and shown here is a picture of how has the computing power in terms of flops changed with years over decades. So the x-axis is the year marked in terms of decades, and the y-axis are the flops. Flops are floating point operations. So if I add two numbers, let's say I take A and B, add them, that would be one floating point operation, so we call it one flop. Okay? So shown in the picture is this green line, which kind of degenerates to the blue line, but they actually show the computing power. So there is a distinction between the floating point operations and the integer operations. So if I add two real numbers, it has more complexity than adding integers. So that's why there is this distinction. In any case, what I would like you to appreciate is that we started off with these big computers from IBM. They would give, performance something like 67 kilo operations per second, which was a very big number. And this computer would occupy a big hall, bigger than probably any of the hall any university has today. And all that would do this calculation. It would burn enormous amount of energy, require a lot of people maintaining it. But nevertheless, it opened the gates for computing. Then somewhere in the 60s, people could do something like a megaflop, which was again a breakthrough. And this was a machine from control data. Then came these big machines from Cray. So picture shown here is for Cray 1, 1976, which could give you 250 megaflops. It was the supercomputer of its era. Then came the Cray 2, and then Cray also bifurcated into different kinds of, so they bifurcated into two different concepts. Okay, the sequential computing and then also parallel computing. But somewhere in the 90s, people realized that they have to go for massively parallel computers. So there were these efforts from Control Data, there was this effort from Connection Machine, which is from the Thinking Machines Corporation. And it could give you gigaflops of operations. So you can see, people are jumping by, of order of 10 to the third in terms of computing power, maybe every decade or decade and a half. People thought this was really the high-end computing. This is the Connection Machine 5 version, which has 1,000 processors, and it was really state-of-the-art and very, very expensive machine. Unfortunately, the market is very competitive, and the money required to design such machines, sell them, and operate them, it just did not work out, and most of these vendors, they went bankrupt. Okay. Then came the Earth simulator from Japan, which is something like 36 teraflops. Then of course the Cray Jaguar, which was in 2010, almost 10 years ago, which is almost a petaflop, and people are talking about exaflops and whatnot. So just to give you an idea, a computer that most of us use for word processing these days, a laptop, would give you a performance which is in excess of a gigaflops, a few gigaflops. So you would be doing better than a Cray right on your desktop. Typical Linux clusters with 100 or 200 nodes would give you, tens of teraflops, and you would like to go to at least a petaflop, which is now what the National Supercomputing Mission of India is trying to do through CDAC by establishing centers at various places and even having some central facilities. So what is important is not just to get the hardware, but also to have the know-how to be actually able to use it. All modern day computers are massively parallel computers, which means you need a tweak in your algorithm. You cannot use the sequential algorithms which one was satisfied with maybe 2 decades ago. Essentially what is happening is that if I had, let's say, 1,000 numbers and I want to use one person to add these numbers, that's easy. You take one number, add another number to it, then you take another number and add to that count, and then another one, and you do it sequentially. But in a parallel environment, what we are saying is that, I have about, let's say, 50 people to add these 1,000 numbers. So the way I would go about is, I would take these 1,000 numbers and distribute them evenly in 50 people. And then hopefully they would all add their individual numbers, 1,000 by 50, whatever that number is, something like 20. And they would add these very quickly. And after that one cycle of adding these 20 numbers, now they need to add their individual scores. So what I can do is I can say, look at the guy on your left and pass your number. Every alternate person should pass their number to the guy on the left. So then 25 people would get a number from their neighbors and they can add them. So then I would have to add now 25 numbers to get the final answer. So mind you, now 25 people are adding, 25 are sitting idle. And in the next step, I can reduce it to 12 people. So I would say, pass your numbers to your neighbor now, and one already has it. You get an additional number. So now 12 people are adding, and 38 are sitting idle, and so on. So you can see that doing a parallel computing has its own overheads, and it does not mean that if I keep increasing the number of processors, then I would automatically get higher performance. There's algorithmic issues. A related issue is the cost. As these systems become bigger, larger, there are bigger breakdowns, they consume more power. So it's rather funny that if I install a machine, let's say with 1,000 processors, and I use 1 megawatt of power to run these machines, I will need another megawatt of power to cool these machines. Okay, so constructing a data center and keeping it up and running, then these machines would generate a lot of numbers because you are computing at a high speed. So how do you store this data and how do you process them is now another headache. And therefore, doing large scale computing has its own problems. And people are really struggling on how to use the tools that you have developed for small compute machines to scale them up to large compute machines. But just to give you an idea that we are talking about not just in a laboratory scale. People are actually using this in commercial setting. So here is a slide from Boeing where they suggest that all their studies are done using these three tools: 2D CFD, which is kind of cheaper, then the high fidelity three-dimensional CFD, and then of course the main wind tunnel testing, which people swear by, that tool. So what typically they would do is they would do very few tests with wind tunnels, and most of the tests are done using 2D CFD, and very few tests would be done with 3D CFD. And wind tunnel testing is just used to kind of validate the data and make sure that everything is working fine. Here is a picture again from Boeing, which kind of tells us that what is the level of tools they have used over the past few decades, and what is the complementary effect of CFD and experimental aerodynamic study. So the top row shows the tools. So they had some panel codes, Cartesian grid techniques, then they had some finite volume codes, and in fact now they exclusively use finite element codes on unstructured grids. And in the second row you see their products, okay, the 767, the 737, unfortunately, which is going through a crisis, and the Dreamliner and so on. And on the last row you see the tests that they have done. So you can see back in the 80s, most of the products that they designed, they heavily used wind tunnel testing. But now if you look at the newer designs like the 787, they use mostly CFD and very few wind tunnel testing. So there has been a certain shift. But I just wanted to impress upon you that not everything is very hunky-dory. It is not CFD is not just you take a geometry and start computing. And I want to show you an example of what happened to the first simulation for a complete aircraft. So to my knowledge, the first mesh was reported in 1978, and this is a conference where this work was presented by the Swansea Group, so everybody was very excited that now we can design aircrafts using CFD. But the first computation, that too an Euler computation, which is it has nothing like a viscous flow or a boundary layer, plain Euler. That actually the first one was reported in 1986 on a 747-200, whereas the mesh that I have shown you is for a Falcon, a small passenger aircraft. So you can kind of see that simply generating a mesh is just one step, but that does not guarantee getting a good solution. And people had to weather quite a few challenges, and it almost took a decade from generation of a mesh to actually getting a solution. Okay, so with that background, I just wanted to give you a glimpse of what we do at IIT Kanpur. So we have this group where we look at these calculations for using finite element methods. And here is a collage of pictures of some of them I'm going to discuss today, but let me just give you an overview. So the first on the left is the air intake of an aircraft. So I'll be talking about this quite a bit, so I won't spend much time here. In the first row on the right, that's flow past a circular cylinder, which is a 3D calculation, and we are interested in finding the transition, how the flow goes from a laminar to a turbulent state. Then in the second row and the third row, the first column, these are pictures of bluff bodies undergoing vortex-induced vibrations. So one single body, two bodies, and these can get quite complex. Then in the second row you have airfoils at transonic speeds but unsteady flow. Then multi-element airfoils where during takeoff and landing you have these slats and flaps. Then there's these pictures of shuttlecocks, the duck feather and the feather shuttlecocks, the synthetic shuttlecocks. We've spent some time on understanding what is the difference between these flows. Then some capabilities to refine the mesh adaptively. So if you look at, for example, flow past a cylinder at high speed, you would get these bow shocks and expansion fans. So how can we refine the mesh to get better resolution? So that technology. Then doing the linear stability analysis for flows, just like you can get eigenmodes and eigenvalues for structures, you can do the same thing for fluid systems. The picture on the right here is actually flow over the wing of the Tejas, the light combat aircraft. So our group was the first one to do a viscous transonic flow calculation and actually compare the data which ADA had obtained from the wind tunnels. There was a project we undertook for trains. So what if we want to retrofit some locomotives for higher speeds? So this was sponsored by the Indian Railways. They wanted some quick answers because there was some plan to increase the speed of all locomotives across the nation. I'll show you some examples of ram air parachutes, so I will not say much about that here. And then if you want to design wind tunnels, high-speed wind tunnels, you can actually use CFD to do that. Okay, so how do you go about it? Well, I showed you the flow equations. So what you now want to do is come up with a numerical method that can solve them. So there are many methods available: finite difference, finite volume, spectral methods. We use the finite element method. So the flow equations, in the green color you see the Galerkin terms of them. So I am not going to describe the method, that would take too much time. And then the blue and the red terms are essentially the stabilization terms, because it turns out if you just use the Galerkin method for these parabolic equation systems, which may actually tend to hyperbolic for high-speed flows, then you can get all kinds of instabilities. So you have to numerically add some terms to stabilize them. So we use something called the SUPG, the streamline upwind Petrov-Galerkin, and the PSPG, pressure stabilizing Petrov-Galerkin, and some other terms for least squares of the continuity equation. So I'm not going to give you too many details about this, but if there are questions at the end, maybe I can address them. Okay, so once we have an algorithm, the next challenge is to put it in a parallel framework so that we can actually do large scale problems. Okay, so the idea is that shown here is the first Linux cluster that we acquired at IIT Kanpur from DST, and this had 32 nodes, 64 processors, and the backbone was a gigabit switch. So what we want to do is, because it's an unstructured mesh, we really want to make sure that each processor receives some elements, but the communication between them should be as little as possible. They should kind of work independently. So we use this domain partitioning technique, wherein we divide the whole domain into these partitions so that the elements at the interface are minimal. Okay, so essentially the idea is that you make volumes which have least surface area. I mean, that's the kind of approach that one takes, and then you distribute each one of these clusters to a processor on your parallel machine, and then let them compute parallelly. And of course, they would need information at the interface, but hopefully that information is not so much, and therefore you can get fast calculations. And typically we use MPI libraries, message passing, and the solver that we use is based on GMRS with some preconditioners. Typically the data structure consists of three levels at the nodes of a mesh, then the elements, and then the equations. So those of you who are familiar with the finite element method, you will realize that the integrals over for the domain happen over elements, but the information is stored at nodes, and of course calculations are done at an equation level. So one has to go back and forth between this triad and make sure that the data structure is efficient. So the underlying mantra is that calculations are fast, but communication is expensive. So you want to communicate as little as possible. Of course, you cannot eliminate it, but you want to minimize it. So that's the underlying design of the algorithm. So just to give you an idea about the time that one would spend in various activities. So the codes that we have, you spend almost 80% of the time in the solver, AX equal to B. And the communication use only about 10% of the total time. Okay. Now mind you, as you go to larger machines, so if you take bigger problems and you have bigger computers, then of course you would have more processors to communicate with, and of course the processors also become faster. So the processor that we have today is much faster than what we had maybe 2 decades ago. But communication has not increased speed by the same level. That has kind of increased at a very small rate. So what happens as you get faster computers and bigger computers, you can churn out things faster, but then the communication becomes a bottleneck. So one problem with the scaling up of these calculations is that with time, as your computers get faster, your cluster actually becomes more inefficient. Okay, so this is a computer that we have at our institute. It is shared by the whole institute, about 3,000 cores, and roughly 640 would be available to a user because multiple users are running jobs. So, and the backbone is an InfiniBand, about 40 gigabits per second. So I want to show you some scaling studies that how do these calculations they scale up. So we talk about something called a speed up. That means if I was using a single processor and I took a time t, and the x-axis is the number of cores or processors that I use. So suppose I was to use 700 processors. Ideally speaking, I should speed up by a factor of 700. It should run 700 times faster. But of course that will not happen because there are overheads, okay? Communication overheads and many other issues. So I just wanted to show you what a typical code performs on a cluster like this. So the ideal line would be the red line, but you never get that. Okay. So let's look at the first one, the mesh one, which is a small mesh with only 2 million nodes, and we are talking about 16 million nodes, 16 million equations being solved every nonlinear iteration, every time step. So this mesh does well up to maybe 200 cores, and after that it starts saturating. In fact, when you go to 500 cores, and if you try to go beyond that, the performance will actually deteriorate. Okay, so if you're using a small mesh, then I suppose you are better off with maybe 100 to 200 cores. Now, as you will see, we go to bigger meshes, So the last one is the Mesh 5, is about 50 million nodes, which leads to about 370 million equations, which is a fair size problem. And that's shown in this brown squares, solid squares. And you can see it's giving a fairly good speed up. So with about 600 processors, I am getting about 550 times the speed that I can get on a single processor. So it's really worth the effort to speed up the calculation on a large machine. So the whole idea is that as you get a bigger computer, you can solve bigger problems. Okay, you don't solve a small problem on a big computer. You solve big problems on big computers. That's the message. So if I was having a problem which was running slow on today's computer, and I felt that maybe if I had a bigger computer I could do it faster 10 years later, that would be fooling myself, because the efficiency of the computer would not be as good as with a larger number of processors. So the only way to do is to solve bigger problems if you want to stay in the game. And of course that's also a blessing, because when you solve bigger problems you can resolve your flow structures more, or you can solve more complex problems. Okay. All right, so this was just a background, and I hope you get a fair idea of what CFD is, what is the background of the codes that we have. And now in the next whatever time I have, I would like to spend it on essentially some applications that I would like to discuss. Okay? So the first one would be flow in air intake. Then we will talk about an airfoil, then an airfoil being modified to a finite wing where you would get a wingtip vortex. Then I'll give you some ideas of parachute aerodynamics, some fluid structure interactions. And this last one is really time permitting. I don't think I will have enough time to reach there. But if I do, because I have interest in sports aerodynamics, so I'll show you some analysis that we've done for badminton shuttlecocks. Okay, so first air intake. Please excuse me, I'll just take a drink. Just my throat is getting parched. Sorry about that. All right, so maybe I'll just check. Dr. Thakkar, is everything going okay? Are you able to hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. How much time do I have, roughly?
You are still having about 45 minutes.
45 minutes, great. Okay, thank you. So let's talk about the air intake. So I have shown you here a picture of a beautiful aircraft, a supersonic aircraft, which of course is no longer operated for a variety of reasons. So I will not discuss those reasons. But what we want to study about this is, the air intake. So let me explain you what an air intake is. Essentially, there are these engines which power the aircraft. Okay, these could be turbojet engines, these could be turbofan. So for the Concorde, they are actually turbofan engines, and these are called air-breathing engines in the sense that as they fly, they capture the air from the atmosphere, and that air is mixed with the fuel inside the engine, and that fuel is the burnt fuel and air mixture that is expanded through a nozzle, and that's what gives you the thrust. And of course, there could also be a fan which gives the additional thrust. The problem is the following: these aircrafts are moving at a very high speed. We are talking about a supersonic speed, so more than the speed of sound in air. So imagine that you are burning a candle and you are flying the candle at a very high speed. Obviously, this candle would flame out, in the sense that there's a warm air around the candle, and that kind of heats up the wick, which melts the wax, and then the wax through surface tension reaches the flame. But if you move the candle at a high speed, just so you could imagine you are holding a candle and standing on an open jeep, and then as the speed of the jeep increases, essentially the hot air around the wick of the candle, that moves away from the wick, and therefore the candle cools down, and it cannot supply the wax to the wick, and therefore you get a phenomena called flaming out. So the same thing could happen in an aircraft engine. The aircraft moves at very high speed, there is combustion going on in the engine, and then this incoming air could just blow out the flame, and that's no good. So really what typical engines do is that they slow down the air so that the combustion takes place at a very small speed, and then you mix the fuel in it, and you have a stable flame downstream of it. So that's the purpose of an air intake. So let me show you the next picture. So this is a closer view of the air intake of a Concorde. So the air goes in through these pods, and there are engines downstream of it. So the high speed air should be slowed down to low speed, and it should be done in an efficient manner, in the sense that the kinetic energy should be still converted to maybe high pressure, and the engine should receive a mass flow at a uniform velocity profile. Okay, so that's the job of an air intake. It's a passive device, but the design is very important. Otherwise, you would get all kinds of problems with the engine. Here is a more complex air intake for a reusable launch vehicle or something like a space shuttle. So on the belly of this aircraft, you would have an engine, and a close-up view is shown here on the lower view graph. So there's high-speed air coming in, then you would like to slow it down through a set of shocks. So you can see there are two shocks, first one at one ramp angle, then another one, and then you inject fuel, and hopefully there's a strong shock here, a normal shock, after which the flow becomes very slow, subsonic. Then you inject fuel, the combustion takes place, then you expand it, and that's what propels your aircraft. So we would like to do the analysis of this air intake, okay, and understand the dynamics of it, that what can one do or what can one not do. So let me therefore explain to you. Maybe I go to the previous slide and explain to you from the pilot's point of view what the pilot sees. So the pilot is sitting in the cockpit, and he is controlling the speed of the vehicle through a variety of parameters, but primarily through throttle. Okay, throttle is essentially the fuel control. So when the pilot wants the aircraft to move faster, he increases the fuel flow rate. Okay, so he puts in more fuel, just like in a car you would step on the gas. And what that does is, it increases the pressure inside the chamber. So you put more fuel, you get higher temperature, higher pressure inside your combustion chamber. Now imagine there is a free stream pressure, the static pressure outside, and there's high pressure inside the engine. Now there should be some equilibrium in this upstream region between the combustion chamber and of course the engine face. And if not, if this pressure in the combustion chamber is too large and this air intake cannot adjust to it, then clearly it's not going to work out. You are going to get off design conditions, and things are not going to be good. So the challenge is that I as a pilot would like to make sure that as I increase the pressure inside the engine, which is primarily because of combustion, my air intake should still give me adequate flow through it. So essentially, from a CFD point of view, the question that I am asking is that as I increase the pressure inside my engine, what is the mass flow rate that I get through the engine, A, and B, what is the performance in terms of the efficiency of the compression and see what is the flow distortion. Okay, so these are the questions that I will ask. Okay, so when you go to high speed flows, you can essentially have these different kinds of intakes. So this is an external compression intake. You can see in this view graph, there is an engine cowl. Okay, so you can think of it as an axisymmetric engine. So the black line is the engine cowl, and there is a center body. This forms a conical shock, and then a normal shock exists at the lip of the cowl and the center body. So this flow is subsonic. That's why it is shown in dark blue color. So this is totally external. So all the compression is taking place external to the engine. Then you could get a situation where the entire compression is internal, where you can see the engine cowl is shown here, the center body, and there are these series of oblique shocks. They reflect, and then you get a normal shock, which does the final compression, and then the subsonic flow, wherein you can burn the fuel. Or you could get a mixed compression where the center body is slightly outside the cowl zone. So you get the mix of both external and internal. Okay. If I look at a mixed compression air intake, which is what I will show you, then you could have three kinds of operations. Okay. The supercritical operation, where you get a series of shocks, and then the final shock that you get, the normal shock, that is downstream of the throat. Throat is the minimal cross-section area of the engine. Now this is a stable situation. So I am not going to elaborate on why, but please take my word for it, that an engine would be stable if it has an operation such that the normal shock is downstream of the throat. Okay. So this is a good operation. The only problem is that the efficiency is low. As you are aware, there are losses across a shock. So I would like the shock to be as weak as possible to get minimal shocks. The shock is weakest when the Mach number is close to 1, and that happens near the throat. So that leads to the critical operation. So this critical operation is the most efficient operation, but it is marginally unstable in the sense that the shock is sitting at the throat. If there is a small fluctuation inside the combustion chamber, this shock can move upstream, and the moment it moves upstream, that would lead to a subcritical operation, which is unstable. So this is very dangerous, the subcritical operation, in the sense that this shock will be thrown out of the engine, and there would be very few fluid air particles that come into the engine, and the engine would get starved, and you would get virtually no combustion. Okay, so that's dangerous. You don't want to do that. So essentially what is happening is that if you are a fighter pilot and you are trying to put your aircraft through a maneuver, let's say a dogfight, and you push more fuel into your engine, then you would get a stronger pressure here. So you would push the shock upstream, and at some point it would go beyond the throat for a high pressure ratio, and that would become unstable, which means you would not get enough airflow rate through your engine, and your engine would flame out, you would lose power, and then the enemy can kill you because you will not be able to reignite your engine. So this could be a serious accident. Okay, having shown you the physics now let me show you some CFD results. So here is a model of engine where we will not worry about the combustion. So we are only going to worry about the air intake part and apply a back pressure simulating an engine and look at the performance of the aircraft, of the intake. So this is the geometric model. So we will have two ramps, a shock coming from the first ramp hitting the lip, another one hitting the lip, then some reflections, and then the throat, and we would apply a back pressure downstream of the intake, which of course is feeding an engine, but we are not simulating the engine. Okay, this is a finite element mesh. So we have a fine mesh close to the cowl of the engine, to capture the boundary layer and so on. Okay, here is a picture of a flow. So this is a viscous flow. Mach number is 3, Reynolds number is 1,000,000, and we do nothing, and you can see that this flow is not acceptable. So what is shown here is Mach number. The coloring scheme is red is Mach 3, dark blue is Mach number 0, and then the colors are interpolated in between. And you will see that the flow has separated because of the adverse pressure gradient because of the shocks. So virtually very little flow is going through the engine, and this is not good at all. Okay, so this is a poor design of an engine, and this would never operate. Typically what aircrafts do is they apply boundary layer bleed. So there's a perforation on the cowl and the ramp, and some boundary layer is sucked out, and therefore you can control the boundary layer and get a good flow. So the first question we asked is, what kind of a boundary layer should we apply? Where should we apply the bleed? So calculations were carried out. So this is a picture of the case with no bleed. So we kind of figured out where are the boundary layers separating. Then we applied bleed. So here is an example that we applied 9% bleed both on the cowl and on the ramp, and then that leads to a start of the engine. So let me show you an example. So this was without the bleed. Now let me show you an example with bleed. So this is a 6% bleed, and you can see this flow completely started, and vorticity is also shown that there is hardly any flow separation. Okay, this picture is essentially what happens for different mass flow rates, or what is the mass flow rate for different back pressure. So a typical plot would look like this. So let's concentrate, for example, on the red line. So red line is with 6% bleed. So I am a pilot, and I keep applying a back pressure, a high back pressure, which means I increase my throttle. Up to some point I get a high mass flow rate through my engine. This is a non-dimensional mass flow rate, so that's good. But at a certain back pressure, when I apply a throttle, you see hell breaks loose. So I get very little mass flow rate through the engine, and this is no good. So my engine can actually unstart. So as you keep increasing the bleed, you can get a higher range of operation of the engine. So for example, for this 27% bleed, which is very large, you can get a back pressure of maybe 27. So what that means is, if you have atmospheric pressure, you can have 27 atmospheres inside the combustor, and that's a very large back pressure. So that would give you a lot of thrust. Let me show you what happens. So here is a case of, I will show you for a back pressure of 21. Okay, what does the operation look like? So this is an acceptable operation. So here is a back pressure of 21, and what you see is that the flow upstream of the throat is virtually steady. Not much is happening. It is, you can just see some Mach waves at the region of bleed, but virtually steady flow upstream of the throat. But then you have some unsteady activities downstream of the throat. The flow is a little bit unsteady, but still acceptable. You are getting a decent airflow to the combustor, and therefore this would be good. Now we will increase the back pressure to a larger value, and you will see that this shock, which is right now at the throat, oscillating somewhere close to the throat, this will now start moving upstream. So one of the two things can happen as you increase the back pressure. A, the engine can completely unstart, and that's the end of the situation. Or you can get an instability which is called buzz. Okay, so buzz, as the name suggests, it's a buzzing sound, a very high frequency sound, where the boundary layers and the natural frequency of this engine duct, they interact, and the shocks will go back and forth. So I want to show you some animations of a buzz instability. So I'll show you two types of buzz instability. There's something called a little buzz and another one which is called the big buzz. So the little buzz is because of shear layer instability. It's a little bit weak, and the big buzz is really very heavy instability, which is driven by the acoustic waves, and they are both driven by the acoustic modes of the pipe. So the resonant frequency can be determined by the pipe. So shown here is a quarter wave inside a pipe. So you can imagine that there's an engine which is applying a back pressure, so that's like a closed end, and then there's a intake which is the open end, and a wave could sit here. And so here's an example of a little buzz. Please take some time and enjoy it, and I'll explain to you in a moment. So this is an example of a little buzz where you can see that the instability goes upstream, interacts with the shear layer, and then again moves downstream. So if you look at the mass flow rate through the engine, it is overall positive. So you are getting a mass flow rate, but a lower mass flow rate, but in a very cyclic manner, and it has a frequency, a non-dimensional frequency, which is also marked here. I'll now show you an example of a big buzz. So here is a big buzz, which is actually very high frequency, and this is, you can see, massive flow separation and driven by a completely acoustic instability. You can see massive flow separation. Okay. In fact, it's interesting. So if you look at in each cycle, for the majority of the cycle, there is flow going through the engine, but then there is a part of the cycle in which the reverse flow. So the flow goes from the plenum back into the throat and outside the air intake. So it kind of spills over the cowl, and that's not healthy. So this is you don't want the pilot to go through this instability. In fact, it can resonate with the structure of the aircraft, because you can imagine if your air intake is giving you this kind of a mass flow rate, so the thrust will also have similar oscillations, and it can actually interfere with the structure of the aircraft and its control system. Okay, you can get an instability which starts with a big buzz, and then it can go into, so it can start with a little buzz and then go into a big buzz. So here is an animation. I'll just play it so that you can enjoy it. So this is a little buzz, and at some point it will become a big buzz. Yeah, here you go. Now it has become a big buzz, a massive flow separation. Okay, so those were aircrafts at very high speeds. But what about fighter aircrafts like light combat aircraft or the advanced medium combat aircraft, the AMCA? So then you can have these viaducts. Okay, so some pictures are shown here, and very quickly I want to show you the instabilities in viaduct. So you have these limbs, top limb and bottom limb. So there are two ducts, as you can see, almost like a nose of a human being, and they get connected maybe to the lungs. Okay, so this is the tracheal column. So what happens when the aircraft is in a side slip? So it's doing a maneuver where it is the flow is not symmetric. Then maybe you could get higher mass flow rate through one duct and lesser mass flow rate through the other, and then interesting things can happen. So we want to simulate that, and these are the boundary conditions, but I will not bore you. A finite element mesh. This is how a typical flow looks like. So this is a numerical Schlerin where you can see the very interesting shock structures. These are the different kinds of flows that you can get. Okay, so the x-axis is the pressure ratio, the y-axis is the side slip angle, which means the aircraft is actually slipping sideways. And you could get these very interesting regimes where you could get shock trains, then bow shocks, and you could also get a buzz instability and an unstart. Unfortunately, I am running out of time. Dr. Thakur, how much time can I take at the most?
You can take, sir, 15 to 20 minutes.
15 minutes, okay. Thank you. All right. So I'll try to finish as soon as I can. So maybe I show you, this picture of what happens to the mass flow rate through the engine with back pressure. And just like you saw in the earlier intake, you get a good performance up to some back pressure and then it starts deteriorating. Okay, and that's no good. We actually want a high mass flow rate through the engine throughout the design regime. So I can show you some results from simulations. As you increase the back pressure, you can see the flow goes through some very interesting changes. The plots are the mass flow rate through the upper and the lower limb. Unfortunately, I don't have time to show you the details. I just want to highlight for you a case of buzz instability, which is very catastrophic, and you want to avoid that. So I'll show you the last case, this pressure ratio 3.3. Let me show you the animation for that. Okay. So this is what is called a buzz instability, and so the angle of attack is so the side slip angle is 5 degree, and typically what is happening that the flow goes in through the lower limb, okay, and then it kind of comes out at times through the upper limb. So it is just like in yoga you do jal neti. Okay, that you kind of put in water through one nostril and it comes out through the other nostril. So because your aircraft is side slipping, so the air goes in through one limb and it meanders through this path and comes out through the other limb, and the engine gets completely stopped. In fact, that is what is happening to the mass flow rate. Okay, through one limb you are getting a positive mass flow rate, and then through the other one you are getting a negative mass flow rate because actually the flow is going in the reverse direction. And this is an absolute no. You don't want this in a fighter aircraft. I mean, this would be a disaster. So unfortunately you cannot study these things in experiments because the time scale is extremely small. The velocities are so high. So CFD is a very good way of looking at these instabilities. And maybe we move on now I just wanted to give you some examples from wings, from external CFD. So here is an example of flow over a wing, and you get these very interesting wingtip vortices. Okay? So we are interested in understanding the role of these wingtip vortices with the transition over the wings, a laminar to turbulent transition. So those of you who are not from aerospace, I just wanted to show you with some slides from a site in NASA. So what happens at low angles of attack and high angles of attack? So angle of attack is essentially this airfoil. If I draw the chord line and I draw an angle with respect to the flight path, that is the angle of attack, which is marked here as A. So at low angles of attack, you get an attached flow. These are streamlines, smoke visualization. And then if you increase the angle of attack, you get a massively separated flow. Okay, so of course, if you are interested in the lift on an aircraft, then as you increase the angle of attack, it increases linearly up to some point, and then because of the separation, it then decreases, and that's called a stall. And you could get very high drag. Okay. Okay. So we did some calculations at Reynolds number 46,000, and for an Epler airfoil, and so the magenta color are 2D calculations, and what we found is it doesn't give a stall. It just So x-axis angle of attack, y-axis is lift coefficient, and of course on the right is the drag versus alpha. So we were shocked to see that if you do 2D calculations, you don't see a stall at all. The lift just keeps on increasing. And of course this is wrong. There are two sets of experiments from the group of Burns and another one Mueller. So the red line and the black line. There's a considerable difference between them. I don't want to discuss why, so there's a reason for that. But notice that they see a stall. So then we tried 3D calculations, and of course we also saw a stall. Okay, so the results are reasonable with 3D calculations, and 2D calculations are actually junk. And in fact, you can see the difference between 2D and 3D. 2D give a very different results than 3D. So we then did 3D calculations to understand flow over N-Doppler airfoil. So I'll just show you something very quickly. I'll skip a lot of slides and maybe just show you something which might you find interesting. So if you keep the angle of attack at 10 degree and do a calculation in different Reynolds number, typically what people find is that you get some 2D flow at very low Reynolds number. This is a little bit more than 1000. Then you start developing these hairpin vortices which become kind of complex, and then you can see the complexity in the flow, and here at around 87,000 you can see a completely turbulent flow. So in this work, which if you are interested you can look at this 2019 paper, we've been able to show how the flow goes from a two-dimensional state to almost a turbulent state at almost a Reynolds number of 50,000 to 90,000. In fact, if you look at the spatio-temporal evolution of the flow, so the x-axis is the time, the y-axis is actually the span direction. You can see the complexity of the flow. So we have shown the local lift distribution across the span from a very nice periodic flow to an extremely chaotic flow when it becomes completely turbulent. There's an interesting feature called the laminar separation bubble. So this happens at around Reynolds number 20,000. So you can see up to Reynolds number 19,000. If you time average the flow, there's a big recirculation zone. But at 20,000, the separated flow becomes turbulent, and then it reattaches, and there's a massive increase in the lift. So if you held the Reynolds number, so if you held the angle of attack constant but change the Reynolds number, then you would see a low lift up to some point, and boom, at some Reynolds number the lift would dramatically increase. So that's because of a laminar separation bubble. So now here at 46,000, the bulk of this flow is turbulent, and it is an attached flow. In fact, the velocity profiles are very interesting. So these are the velocity profiles at different sections. So I've shown a profile going through the separation bubble. There's a recirculation zone, and then downstream of the bubble you can see a laminar profile followed by a log law, which is actually shown in this picture. It matches very well with the log law, thereby confirming that it is a turbulent boundary layer. Okay. Some calculations for the effect of the wingtip vortex. So we have taken a finite wing now. Okay, so this is there's a wingtip vortex that emanates, and there's vortex shedding going on from the root part of the wing, and then we want to see what is the effect of the aspect ratio, and you can see it's a very complex interaction. Okay, unfortunately I don't have time to show you the details. Maybe I'll just show you one picture. That here is in the top row there is the end-to-end wing, almost like an airfoil, where you see very nice hairpin structures. This is a Reynolds number 1000, and angle of attack is 14 degree. But the moment you go to a finite wing where you have a wingtip vortex, then these flow structures they become very complicated. So in addition to these hairpins, you get these three-dimensionality, and some extremely interesting vortex linkages that lead to incredible change in the performance of the uh, wing. So I think to end, maybe I'll show you one more calculations, which you might find interesting, and then I'll stop with that. Let me see. Uh, okay, maybe this one would be good. So we are trying to do fluid structure interaction, wherein we are interested in finding out if I push in fluid at a high pressure inside a balloon, can I predict the shape of a balloon? So you can imagine that there is a membrane, and we are doing fluid structure interaction. So flow inside the balloon, outside the balloon is being simulated. So if you have a very elastic membrane, then you get this oblate shape. Okay, and then if you go to a relatively low elasticity, then actually you can get these balloons which are kind of elongated. So you can predict that. Maybe one last image of a fluid structure interaction, and then I will stop. I'm sorry for having taken so much time. Let me see which is the most. Okay, maybe this one you may find interesting. So here is a calculation that we are doing now of actually interaction of a flexible filament attached to a bluff body, and there's an unsteady flow, and we want to excite spontaneously the various modes of this filament. So depending on the flexibility, which is highlighted by this parameter U star. I'm sorry, I'm not explaining you what U star is, but please take my word for it, that higher the U star, the more flexible is the filament. You can get all the way from exciting the first mode to the second mode to the third mode, and possibly third and fourth mode. And you can get very interesting vortex shading patterns. And I will just show you one last slide which kind of highlights the vortex shading patterns. So you can get the 2S pattern where one pair of vortex is released, or you could get two pairs of vortices are released in the wake, or maybe two pairs and two single vortices, and so on. So it is very exciting. I will stop here, and I'm sorry for taking more time than I was supposed to. But I suppose in the online mode, because you don't get feedback from the audience, you are kind of talking to yourself. But you have been very kind, and thank you very much. I'll be happy to address any questions if you have any.
Thank you very much, sir. Any participant has any kind of question, they can ask.
Hello, sir.
Yes, sir.
Sir, good afternoon.
Thank you. Good afternoon.
Sir, I want to ask that how the selection of intake and the that will change the RPS of the aircraft.
I'm sorry, I'm not able to hear your questions. Can you be a little louder, please?
Hello, sir. Now I am audible. Hello.
Yeah, please go ahead. Can you just say it loudly? I know you are asking about intake, but I could not hear the question.
Okay. Sir, now I am audible.
Yeah, you are audible.
Sir, I want to ask why the selection of the intake will change the RPS of the aircraft.
How does?
The selection of intake.
Left arm.
Can you mention your question in Petrov, please?
Now I'm audible.
Yes, you are audible.
Yes.
I want to ask that how the selection of air intake of aircraft and the duct of aircraft will change RCF of the aircraft.
Oh, I see. Okay, very good. Okay, so I think your question is about the stealth aspects and the performance. So very nice. Okay, So typically what happens, maybe I show you some pictures of these aircrafts, and that would answer your question partly. Um, yeah, let's look at these aircrafts. So typically what happens when you have fighter aircrafts, stealth is a very big issue, that you don't want the enemy to know that your aircraft has approached. So you want to evade the radar. So typically, one of course is the RCS, where the electromagnetic waves can reflect. So that is one aspect. The other is the thermal signature of the engine, because the engine gives out very hot exhaust, and one way to fool the radar is that it should not see the hot spots. So typically in fighter aircraft, what they would do is, you don't want your engine flame to be in the line of sight. So that's why you can see they would curve the intakes, or so you should not have a situation where you can have a electromagnetic wave going in through the intake upstream, and it can be in the line of sight of the fire of the engine flame. So that's why you bend them so that it doesn't reach it. Okay. So typically when you have these viaducts, or you can even have twin bends in the ducts, they would typically mitigate the stealth capability. Okay, but they are bad for performance. So the higher the bend or the curvature in the intake, the worse will be the performance, because you will have all kinds of flow separation. So typically in these aircrafts, there would be a optimization that you would have to carry out between the stealth capability and your engine performance.
Okay, sir. Actually, sir, I just know that recently the serpentine shaped ducts are tested for our advanced medium combat aircraft. So that's why I am asked. Yes, sir.
Right. So the advanced medium combat aircraft is a fifth generation aircraft, where the stealth is a very big issue. So you are right. It has twin engines, unlike the light combat aircraft. So the light combat aircraft has a viaduct, okay, where two intakes will merge into one, okay, which is the calculation I showed you. But the AMCA is actually twin engine. So each one of them is a separate duct, and it's called an S duct. So it's a serpentine duct, but the two of them are not joining. They are feeding independently to each engine. So the dynamics there is quite different than the dynamics of the viaduct of the LCA. You are absolutely right.
Sir, last question.
Yeah.
Sir, it is a little bit of our topic, but sir, in first two slides, I have seen the model of LCA Tejas and the temperature distribution of what in our hypersonic test demonstrator vehicle. So
Okay.
IIT Kanpur is working with ADA and DRDO for this development.
Right. So you see what typically happens, as a nation, when you are developing some capabilities which are on the forefront, then you have to use all the capabilities present in the country. So I think what the DRDO lab has rightly done is, they have gone around and seen who is doing what, and they are trying to involve as many people as they can. So for the LCA program, for example, I was contacted way back in '95, as soon as I came back to India. So the CFD group of the LCA, they were very kind, and they gave me an opportunity to work with them. And so I did not work, so I had very limited access to the real information, okay, because so it's all classified. But as far as the technology aspect is concerned, how things work, there is a possibility of working with them. Similarly, with the National Wind Tunnel Facility, we did a lot of experiments which are useful to DRDO. Some of them are dummy experiments, that they don't test the real geometry or the real prototypes of what they have, but they are kind of they give the flavor of what is happening, and sometimes they do real testing also. So all that is possible.
Thank you very much, sir.
Sure.
Yes, any other participant having any question?
Good afternoon, sir.
Yes,
Yeah, good afternoon.
Sir, I did look more, sir. Sir, I want to know that, sir, in meshing, sir, means in grid generation, in
Uh-huh.
CFD, that you said that the big how much the system will be big and the processor will be more. There will be the fast in result, and it will give the fast solution, as in it will take less meshing time. So I want to know that in a supercomputer or in a quantum computer, we can do the meshing and it will give the fast result, or it will take the same time while we solving the complex problem
Okay.
or large equation.
Okay. So I have again projected the slide of the aircraft mesh, and you see, so first of all, let's understand mesh generation. What is mesh generation? So suppose you give me an aircraft and ask me to do a calculation on it. So the first thing is I must have the geometry of the aircraft, right? Now it turns out that defining a geometry of a complex body is a very big challenge. Okay, so if I had to define all the surfaces that make an aircraft, it turns out it is a very complex problem. Just imagine so many curved surfaces, engines, antennas, landing gear, there are holes in it. So if I make a geometry, then when I put it in my meshing software, it should appear as an acceptable geometry. Sometimes there will be holes. I will model, for example, the wing and I will model the fuselage. But at the junction, they may not match properly. There may be some holes in there or some overlapping. So it turns out that even after you make a so-called geometry of a body that seems okay, when you are trying to make a mesh on it, you will have to repair it and make sure that it is acceptable for mesh generation. Typically, what people have found is, even today, that it may take several months. So suppose you give me the new, let's say Airbus 320 and ask me to do some calculations, and you give me a geometry. Just to repair the geometry and get it inside my AutoCAD for meshing purposes, that itself may take me several months with several people. So that's the first step. The second step would be to generate a surface mesh, given so what is shown here in the diagram, the surface mesh on a Falcon. So I would have to generate that for an Airbus. That also is a very tedious process. And of course, that would depend on the computing power that I have and the algorithm that I am using. I may decide to use a commercial software. It's possible. Now, I can then once have the surface mesh, now I try to generate a volume mesh. That means the mesh on the outside, which is actually occupied by the fluid. Okay, and that mesh will also take a long time. For example, we are generating a mesh on a sphere, a simple sphere, with something like 100 million grid points. And generating that mesh on a machine with 4 cores, it is taking us about 10 to 12 hours. And then repairing that mesh and making it compatible with our fluid dynamics code, it takes about 5 days of running on that computer. So the point is that these are also long calculations, and it depends on the software that you have. If you have a commercial software, for example ANSYS, they will charge you differently for a sequential machine license and a parallel computer license. So you'll have to spend more. Then they will have some constraints on what kind of a license they can give you. They will not sell a very high-end license to India, for example, because they are worried about security issues and so on. So in a nutshell, what I want to convey to you is that if you talk only about the mesh generation, it is not just dependent on the computer that you have. It is also heavily dependent on the software that you are using, either your own software or the commercial software. What is the capability of that, as well as the licensing issues.
Sir, and my last question is that
Yeah,
you you mentioned in that slide about parallel computing and high performance. In
that's right.
sir, that is the old means that is using very decade times. So now you know about the sir cloud computing. Now cloud
Right.
compute yes, now cloud computing, sir, it is taking place in CFD. You know about one company, sir, Scale. It
Uh-huh.
that company is from USA. So that totally analysis is doing in CAE and CFD based on cloud computing.
That's right.
No other. Uh, uh, I want to know that what is the main advantage in that one or disadvantage in that software?
Okay,
Means
okay, good question.
how the cloud computing is now demanding in CFD more.
Right. I know that's a very relevant question. So let us understand a few things. If I want to call myself a CFD person, I could be doing one of the many things. One is I could be developing algorithms to solve problems in CFD. Maybe I am just writing some software which is capable of solving some problems, but I am not solving the relevant problems myself. I am just developing capabilities. That is CFD. Another CFD could be that I am using a code which was developed maybe by my lab or some legacy code, but now I am using that to solve a problem. For example, if I am in a DRDO lab, maybe somebody earlier wrote a code to do CFD, and I now use that code to do calculations for the AMCA, Advanced Medium Combat Aircraft. That is also CFD. Another possibility could be that I am not interested in the code. I just have a tool. I have either bought it or somebody gave it to me. I know very little about it, and I just use that to solve my problem. That is also CFD. Okay, so now suppose I am in the category where I want to solve flow past an aircraft. Okay, I don't have a code of mine, and I want to use a commercial code or an open source, maybe OpenFOAM or something. But I need a hardware. I may not have the resources with me, or the ones that I have, they may not be enough. So now I have an option that I can buy a computer, which maybe I may have to make a data center, a large data center, and maintain it, or I can rent it. So I can tell somebody that I need this computing power, I have the money, I don't want to build mine, I will buy the time for you, and if you give me a reasonable quotation, I will use your time and I will compute on it. Of course, one option is that I can go to a consultant and say, you give me the solution also, and you solve it the way you want, and just I'll pay you the money. Right? That is what a consulting company will do. But we are not talking about that. We are talking about that I want to compute either using my codes or using some open source utility or a commercial code. Okay. Now suppose I am using my code. If I am using my code, then I better know how to program it on the hardware that I have. So if I have a Linux cluster and I am using MPI libraries on it, fine, I will be able to learn how to program, test it, and that's one way of doing it. But the suggestion that you are making is that let's do cloud computing, or maybe somebody else will sell the time to me, and I have a code and I will run it on their cloud. Now the point is, I must know what that cloud is, what is the hardware there, what are the libraries they have, because I will have to compile my code over there. It's not an easy thing to do, right? So one I would say a disadvantage with these buying computer time or with somebody else's installation is that unless you have very good help available there, you may not be able to compile your code and get a good performance out of your code on their hardware. Okay, but if you have your own hardware and you have a good support group, that is possible. Then a good performance is possible. That is one thing. The second thing is cloud computing may sometimes utilize heterogeneous hardware. So they are using, hardware distributed all over the place. So at one place they have some machines, with one configuration and one operating system. In some other installation, they have a different operating system. Maybe the processor speed is also different. So how robust is your application in handling that? If somebody is taking care of it with a good support, then fine. But if you have to do it yourself and that becomes a bottleneck, then that could be a problem. So as of today, if I am using a cloud and a commercial software or an open source which already runs well on it, I think that's okay. But if I am going to build my application on a cloud, it could be a very big challenge. So I don't know if I have answered your question.
Sir, there is one question in the chat box.
Okay.
The Nainish is asking that last year Microsoft had completed a test on underwater data centers. What are your thoughts about it? The second one is underwater data center cooling the future of cooling huge computers?
Right. Right now, I am aware of some of these technologies. So you see, like I made one opening remark that in the present scenario, we first use energy to run the computers, and then we put in more energy to cool them down. So that is not a trivial cost. I mean, almost. So if I want to make a data center, almost 50% or 40% of the money goes in buying the hardware. Then maybe 40% goes in the support hardware, like DG set and air conditioner and whatnot. And then maybe 20% will go for the human resources. So it's a very substantial chunk of money in all of them. Now the cooling technology has also evolved. So the oldest technology is the regular air conditioners, like the window ACs or this commercial ACs which people see in malls or whatever. Then came the era of precision cooling. So what you do is you push cold air directly into the computer in the hotspots, right? So that's why it's called precision air conditioning. Then the third technology came as cooling door, that you actually use to circulate water or some other fluid to cool the heat or to take away the heat directly, and that way the expenses would be a little bit less and it would be cost effective. Now people are coming with some other ideas that the whole data center is located maybe underground or underwater, where it is more cost effective. So earlier these were not possible because there was a problem in the reliability, and I just wanted to give you a number. Suppose I had a huge data center and I had hard disks, let's say 1,000 of them, to kind of back my storage device. Now you can imagine the failure rate that I am going to have. Almost a disk would fail every 2 days just because I have 1,000 disks in my data center. So after 1 year, when these become old, I could get a failure very, very regularly. And I must have a system where I can, replace these hard disks. So first, I should be able to where they're hot swappable. So the hardware should not come down; it should function. And B, I should be able to replace them, the bad hard disks. So I should be able to troubleshoot them where they are, and I should be replacing them. So accessibility is a big issue. So earlier we did not have this technology. I mean, people had to physically go and do things. But I think now with smart robots and with newer technologies, people are able to manage that. And therefore, these things are going to become more mature. And I think this is very doable. So the future paradigm will be very different than what we have today. I think this idea of having data center in every university, everyone making their own data centers, will eventually go away. And it is almost like what I see the food paradigm. Back in the old days, everybody would cook their own food at home, and you can see now that has reduced. People just go to central cooking and buy their food, and there are more choices. Of course, we can debate whether that is good or bad, but that's the reality. People are using central facilities more than they were using earlier. They are not cooking at home as much. And I think the same will happen with computing. Instead of us setting up our own computing resources, maybe we will go to central data facilities and buy time from them, buy resources from them. And then the central people would are well placed to kind of come up with better paradigms which are more efficient, more futuristic, and more efficient. So that's my thought.
Thank you very much, sir. Any other participant having any kind of question? Okay then, so I presume nobody is having any question. So thank you very much.
Time for lunch.
Yes, sir. Okay. So on behalf of the Mechanical Engineering Department, ADIT, I would like to thank sir first for accepting the invitation, and second for being so kind and cooperative throughout our interactions. You have covered all the aspects really nicely in your presentation, starting from the fundamentals of CFD to the parallel computing and the applications of CFD in, say, supersonic air intakes, the parachute aerodynamics, flow fast wings. And secondly, you have also answered the questions in very detail of all the participants. So thank you very much, sir. Looking forward to invite you in further such kind of programs from our institute as well. So thank you, sir.
It's an absolutely a pleasure for me. So thank you very much. I really enjoyed this session, and I'm sorry I could not present things the way I would have liked to, but
Yes, indeed, it was really good.
Okay. I'm glad you like it. Thank you very much. I look forward to our continued interaction.
Thank you very much, sir. Thank you, sir.
I'll log out now. Thank you.
Okay, sir. There is one announcement for participant. The third session will start at 2:30 p.m. Yeah? Okay. Thank you, everyone.